recording on. All right. Good afternoon, everyone. I should turn that sound up 1 second so that we don't hear the echo. My name is Johannes Birringer. I coordinate the Brunel Performance Research Lecture Series. We are delighted today to have a guest with us who will address a very important topic. And Robin, maybe not such an easy act to follow after Daniel Plöger's last seminar. He focused on issues of gender and sexuality and performed in the nude.
Oh, right, okay.
We're not asking you
Too cold today for that.
to step in line. But it's also interesting to me that we are drawing on a diversified audience today, perhaps people coming also from outside, and some of our MA students missing, which is interesting to me because the topic today is so crucial for if they engage in future postgraduate research issues. And we are broadcasting this talk live to our audiences online. So I welcome also our online audience. And now let me introduce our guest, Professor Robin Nelson, who is a Director of Research at Royal Central School of Speech and Drama, University of London. And as I know from previous meetings as well as from the reputation that you have, you are one of the important, crucial pioneers of looking at issues of research also in the current configuration of the research processes in this country, in the UK. And I believe after we announced the event, already people were calling in from Canada, from the US, from Australia, because I think the topic is spreading. I grew up in Germany when you could not make a PhD in an applied research in performing arts, but it may now also be spreading in Holland, Germany, France, Italy. In terms of how PhDs are understood today as productions of knowledge and how you investigate both the practical and the theoretical side of your work. I think Professor Nelson will have a lot to say about this. He's a specialist in this research field and has published widely on the subject. He's, of course, a practitioner and a theoretician in the performing arts and media, and has been also co-founding editor of Critical Studies in Television. So you have a strong interest in media as well. And he is co-editor of very important books on intermediality, which in a way is sort of underpinning our courses here in digital performance, where we are investigating the relation of media between media and the theater. And you have now completed a new manuscript on practice as research in the arts. Interestingly, and I told Stellag about this, in the month of January, one of the discussion lists that we are part of, the Empire Soft Skin Space list, dedicated a whole month to questions of research and practice. And they particularly invited young, emerging career practitioners who had just finished their PhD to comment on their experience. And it was a very vivid and complicated discussion because people had lots of different experiences. So what we will do today is he will be lecturing, and then after a certain time, 45 minutes, I might ask or will ask Stellag to join me in a small curved round table, brief discussion feedback, and then open it out to wider question and answer. So please join me in welcoming Professor Robin Nelson.
Thank you. Thank you, Johannes. It's nice to be back here at Brunel. I haven't been here for some years, so it's good to be back here again. I'm going to talk about practice research, obviously, and the title of my talk is From Practitioner to Practitioner-Researcher, because I find it a useful way to think about people who are practitioners either by way of their education, they've been educated in dance or theatre or any kind of performance making, or professional practitioners who decide they want to become researchers. And my mantra, which is the subtitle for the lecture, is articulating and evidencing a practices research inquiry. So I'm going to be arguing that practice is very much a dimension of research, and practice research is a methodology, I'm going to argue, but there is a difference between creative practice and practice research, and that's what I'm going to try to explain in my talk. The vocabulary is problematic because people use different terms for this domain. Practice research is probably the most common term in the UK. In Australia, practice-led research is the most common term and means exactly what I mean. In Nordic countries and continental Europe, particularly in the visual arts tradition, they talk about artistic research. What's common to all those three terms is that the practice is a method of research and the practice is submitted as evidence of the research. And for me, that's the difference between practice-based research. I reserve that term for writing articles or books about practice, but it doesn't present the practice itself as evidence. Practice as research presents the practice as evidence. And I see practice research very much as an institutional matter. That's to say, I'm not sure whether we'd even have these terms if the arts hadn't got embroiled in the academy in some kind of way. And it's in that interrelationship that I'm interested, and my whole approach is based on that. So I see there being a range of interlocking spheres, many more than the three here, but the arts world, the academic sphere, the media sphere, and other spheres beyond that interlock. And where they intersect around doing thinking, as I call it, that's where practices research is located. And we've needed to address it in this way in institutional terms, because otherwise arts research wouldn't be accepted in the academy. Everybody would have to turn to writing instead of working through their other practices. I talk about the Practices Research Initiative, by which I mean the initiative over probably 2 decades, possibly more now. I feel I've been talking about practices research for a very long time, certainly a couple of decades. So I mean the initiative within the academy to have art practices accepted for PhDs and for staff research, other research. But there are a number of resistances to that initiative. Practices research is well established in the UK. Even here, there are some people who resist it, but generally speaking, it's widely accepted. Similarly, in Australia, it's widely accepted, except there are stronger pockets in certain parts of Australia than in others. I'll say more about that later if you wish. And then in the Nordic countries, notably Finland, arguably Finland was ahead of everybody in terms of developing practices research, but other Nordic countries, Sweden and so on, are very strong also. So in terms of a kind of quick global view, there's resistance in the United States. There's only 2 universities that I know of where you can do a PhD, a practice research PhD in the States. And there are again pockets in continental Europe, but there's also quite strong resistance in places that I wouldn't expect it, like the Netherlands, for example. There are 1 or 2 universities that do undertake practice research PhD, but generally there seems to be no grasp of what it means, and a sense that this can't possibly be PhD worthy. So whilst it's strongly accepted in the UK, it's not elsewhere. But I absolutely agree with Johannes, it's going to change. And the MFA in the States, which has been what they call the terminal degree, which is a rather sad phrase really, but I think that will eventually become the PhD. So what has the PAR initiative achieved so far? It's established in the UK certainly that arts, media and other performative cultural practices may constitute academic research. That artworks and processes may be submitted as substantial evidence of research, and that modes of presentation of arts research might map onto more traditional methods. And indeed the work that I've done is really to try and find an accommodation between arts practices as research and other understandings of research in the academy. Because I don't think we can just come along as artists and say, well, this is what we do, this is our research, that's fine, isn't it? We have to look at what other people do and say, well, how does this map onto your understanding of research? And that's what the Arts Practices Research Initiative has done. So, formerly in the United Kingdom, tutors here will know that there's something coming up shortly called the Research Excellence Framework, which is a national audit of research. And practice research is clearly admissible in that framework, and I'm citing here from the formal REF document. In addition to printed academic work, research outputs may include, but are not limited to, new materials, devices, images, artifacts, products and buildings, confidential or technical reports, intellectual property, whether in patents or other forms, performances, exhibits or events, work published in non-print media. It couldn't be more clear, yet there are still a lot of staff in British universities say practice research isn't accepted. Well, it evidently is. So if anybody tells you it's not, cite the REF handbook at them. So if it's so well accepted, why are there still these misunderstandings about practices research? And the first thing is that people from different worlds have different discourses and varying priorities in terms of research. Academy regulators tend not to like practice research because it upsets their normal methods of doing things. For example, for a practice research PhD, the examiners need to be appointed much earlier usually in order to see the practice live and so on. It just upsets all the normal paths of things, and people don't like that very much. So that's one sort of way of looking at it. Professional artists have misunderstandings about it if they think that their professional practice can simply be presented as research. However intelligent the practice might be, I think you need to do some other things in relation to that practice to turn it into practice research, and that's what I'm going to come to as I go through. And we're still in the academy overshadowed, I think, by the dominance of the scientific method, even though the scientific method in the sciences is itself quite problematic. But there are a number of different discourses, different priorities that militate against simple acceptance. So, there's deep institutional misunderstandings. There's a whole binary division between theory and practice in the Western intellectual tradition, at least since Plato. And I'm not going to go through, do come in. I'm not going to go through all that now. I've written about it elsewhere, and we can come back to it if you like. But that, I think, informs a privileging of theory and a denigration of practice in a kind of popular as well as an academic understanding. Another problem is that no two practice research projects are the same. So it's quite difficult for people to get a sense of what this thing is, this practice research thing, because it's different. If they go to see different projects, they'll be very, very different. And I don't think, if people are working in a subject domain, let's say like history or English literature, the kind of research they do comes out in similar forms, usually in the form of the written thesis in the black book. So people know what that is, but if you're wanting to show a live practice or submit something on a DVD, it's not familiar. I think we're lacking a methodological framework. Part of my work I see as developing that methodological framework, and that's what I'm going to come to in the latter part of my talk today. But because we haven't had one, it's hard, again, for people like university regulators to grasp what our methodology is. And since our approach is very often playful, that makes it even harder to understand. And there's a strong association of the art with leisure, so it's not serious. And Marvin Carlson wrote recently about this in an interesting article about the closure of theatre departments in America, the summary closure, and they were kind of added on that they were closing language departments and just tacked theatre on at the end as if it didn't even get on the radar. And one of Marvin Carlson's beefs was that in the States, theatre is associated with the leisure industry, as distinct from the visual arts and music, which are taken a bit more seriously. Now, I don't think that's such a problem in the UK and elsewhere, but there's still this association. There's the whole entertainment industry. So how can that be research? How can a West End musical be research? It's confusing for people. Then on the other side, coming from another kind of discursive position, there's misunderstanding on the point of view of artists. I think particularly when practice research PhDs were getting going in the UK, professional artists first of all saw it as a funding stream. They could get a grant to do a PhD and that would be a funding stream. And they just thought that their practice could just be presented as research. So for me, there's a misplaced assumption that the maker's investigation is always self-evident in the project, in the product. You may be clear about what your research dimension is, but is it necessarily clear to others? Quite often, I find practitioners are very absorbed, deeply absorbed in their work, and so they should be, but in a way you need to be able to step back from it and bring out the research inquiry, that line through, and that's why my mantra is articulating and evidencing the research inquiry. There's misunderstandings in different arts contexts. In devised practice, for example, there's a misplaced sense that all devised pieces are original in the sense of fresh articulations, but they may not be original in research insight terms. I've seen a lot of forced entertainment derivative pieces over the last decade. So whereas forced entertainment might be original when they first made their work, people who copy it are not being original in research terms, even though the actual piece they produce won't be exactly the same as a forced entertainment piece. And in applied theatre context, I've found since working at Central, where applied theatre is very strong, there's a strong motivation and emphasis on the social project, which detracts from the research inquiry. So you need to articulate and evidence the research inquiry. I'll keep repeating my mantra. Now, here's a question for you to ponder, and I shall be sort of teasing around this. Can we assume that the research inquiry is self-evident in any practice? If signifiers are multi-accented, I'm going into a kind of broad post-structuralist theoretical domain here, if our signifiers are multi-accented and dependent on negotiation in context to achieve, at best, intersubjectively agreed sense, can they ever articulate the context of their own reception? I'll just let you ponder that for a moment. If there is an art object, let's suppose it's a sculpture, so it's a sort of static object there, and it's in an exhibition today, and we go and read it, might we not all have different readings of it? We know from all kinds of audience research and reader response research that people read things very differently because they're differently positioned. If that piece is then shown in 10 years' time in a completely different culture, will it read in the same way? Well, I would have thought evidently not. So if that's our broad understanding that readings are relational and subjective, and that the best we might get into subjective agreement about what's going on, then how can we assume that the research inquiry is self-evident? That seems to be a bit of a problem that we perhaps will talk about afterwards and tease out. So even our language, the term research is used in all kinds of ways in different discourses. Please come in, yeah. With different accents. It itself is a multi-accented term. So we talk about researching things. I'm going to buy a new digital camera. I'm going to research digital cameras. We use that word for it. So I find out and I sift what's known, and then I decide which is the best camera for me. Even in professional spheres, particularly in television and the media, people are employed as researchers. So they're networking, they're finding sources, and they're collating information. They're researchers, they use that term. But academic research has a particular accent. It's about conducting a research inquiry to establish new knowledge. And that's really important to get those differences clear. And I do think that causes confusion. We use the research quite properly with different accents in different contexts. But in academic terms, it has a particular resonance that we have to address. So research outcomes involve new knowledge, or the slightly softer phrase, which I prefer, substantial new insights. But what constitutes knowledge? We have another problem. In the contemporary world, I would argue, absolute knowledge is in question. Since Einstein and Heisenberg, at the beginning of the 20th century, there's a relational aspect that's been established in the process of knowing. And we're talking the sciences here, not the arts. I heard a philosopher on the radio talking recently, suggesting that there was a performative aspect to Descartes' famous cogito, I think, therefore I am, and suggesting in my phrase that it's a kind of doing thinking. I like that. The notion of standpoint epistemologies is very common now in philosophy. So there isn't a universal truth that we would all agree. It depends where we're standing, in an almost literal sense. Where we're coming from, we understand things in a different way. It's another way of expressing that notion of different readings. So if that's how we think of knowledge, knowledge isn't quite as fixed and clear as some people would like us to believe. There's been a broad epistemological shift from positivism in the middle 19th century to the late 19th century. Auguste Comte was the key figure who argued that the kind of knowledge science produces and is the only mode of knowing. A shift from there to postmodern relativism in the mid-20th century. And I mean, I haven't got time to kind of detail this history. I'm sure you're aware of it. But since we know these things, why do we talk as if knowledge is a very clear, fixed thing? So we move from the certainty of knowledge, I would argue, to the process of knowing. And if we make that shift, then practice research and the kind of things that we engage with as arts practitioner researchers become much more possible in that frame. So traditionally, knowledge has been propositional, verbally articulated, and that's the cornerstone of traditional research. So the reason why the Black Book thesis is the PhD medium is because knowledge has been seen to be contained in those terms, in that frame. Whereas practical knowledge is articulated in the knowing doing of praxis, and as yet it's less fully accepted in the academy, though, as I say, in the UK it's pretty widely accepted. So the shift from knowledge to knowing is important, I think, in making the case for practice as research. And I've just picked out a few people who I think have contributed to a lineage of change. Vygotsky, who's a very interesting figure, writing in 1934, an educationist, a psychologist, a polymath, posited that the dialogical character of learning is a reciprocal material ideal engagement, a movement from action to thought. And I'm moving towards, in this talk, to my model. And I realize I came to this after I developed my model, but that's very much what I'm talking about, a movement from action to thought. Vygotsky suggests that in creative activity, inner context-dependent senses gradually unfold their meanings as symbols for others. Again, it's a movement from action to thought, if you want to put it in that more simple phrase. So things that are experienced in the process of practitioner research gradually need to find their way into some kind of articulation. People in that workshop will know what they are in their bodies, maybe, but how then do we disseminate that knowing? Because one of the cornerstones of research in the academy is that it's new knowledge effectively shared, disseminated in some kind of way. Now, books and articles can be moved around fairly readily, particularly in a digital age, but practical processes are less easy to share in that way. So as a community, we've needed to find ways of addressing that. And just another quick quotation from Vygotsky: spontaneous concepts, in working their way upward towards greater abstractness, clear a path for scientific concepts in their downward development towards greater concreteness. Now, this will appear later in my model, except it won't be hierarchical. I'm interested that Vygotsky sees science at the top and practice at the bottom, and they're kind of working their way up to meet each other. I like that idea of them working together, but I see it more as a lateral thing than a hierarchical thing, as you'll see in a moment. But again, this a process of negotiation between perhaps what we might call more abstract thinking and practice-based thinking is what this is. Cutting now to 70-odd years, more than that, to Alva Noe, who's written recently about building on Varela, this notion of inactive perception, argues that perception and perceptual consciousness are types of thoughtful knowledge and activity. So whereas the traditional divide between theory and practice separates body and mind and consciousness and the body, increasingly neuroscientists and others, philosophers, are coming round to the idea that perception and perceptual consciousness are types of thoughtful, knowledgeable activity. No, he says perception depends on the possession and exercise of a certain kind of practical knowledge. And I think he and others would argue it's prior to, as Heidegger would argue, it's prior to a more abstract kind of knowing. Perceiving, he says, is a way of acting. To be a perceiver is to understand implicitly the effects of movement on sensory stimulation. So there's a whole, one can cite a large number of figures, as I do in the book that's just about to be published that Johannes mentioned, in the tradition of phenomenology and so on. I'm just picking out 2 or 3 people who have been part of what's now 100-year-olds challenging of traditional assumptions in positivism. And Susan Melroe, a colleague, notes that some expert practitioners already theorize in multi-dimensional, multi-schematic modes, just as it can be argued that some writers theorize in writing but not others. Now, there are 2 helpful insights in this quotation. First of all, reaffirming that you can theorize in doing, as in the other people I've cited. But the second point, that some expert practitioners, but what about the others? So how do we know when practitioners are theorizing and when they're not? That seems to be a really important question. And she also, I think, in passing almost makes an important point that we tend to think that writing is always transparently clear and that its knowledge is very clear, but it is also gestural. She talks about Bourdieu's concept of the habitus and the idea of kind of that being coined as a kind of gesture to capture something. And for me, that's exactly what writing is. I mean, all kinds of writing, creative writing, critical writing, for me are a creative process. It's finding that means of articulation. And you're gesturing at it in much the same way that you might gesture physically in performance research. So I like Susan's writing on practice research, but that's really useful. So I want to argue then that practice research might emerge as a new methodology out of all this. It's a multi-mode inquiry with many possible methods. Hermeneutic interpretive models of research are much more useful to us than traditional linear scientific models because they tend to be non-linear. They're characterized often as circular or spiraling networks with many points of entry. And the question asked is seen ultimately to determine the answer that you get. So it's not about a kind of direct line. And I'm not sure that science is like this, rather. I'm characterizing it, but you're a linear model of research where you have your research design, you conduct your experiments, and you kind of come out the other end with the answer. But that's the sort of old-fashioned model. And this one is very, very different. And there is no end point, but there are insights. You produce insights, not the final answer. And it seems to me that's useful for all kinds of research, but particularly for practices research. So we're not alone, I want to say. I mean, sometimes artists in the practitioner research context feel they're isolated and they do everything very differently from everybody else. I don't think that's true. There's quite a lot of other disciplines and subject domains that use hermeneutic methods, ethnographic methods, action research methods that are not dissimilar to arts practitioner research methods. Methodology has often been a problematic term for us, and I mean, forms in most universities, if you're applying for a PhD, there's usually a section where you have to say what your methodology is, and people go, what does that mean? Because they have this sense that methodology is methodical, and it's like a science methodology, and as I said earlier, we don't really have that established, though I want to argue we have effectively established it as a practice research methodology. I see methodology as the kind of the philosophical approach rather than the details, which I would call methods. And there are many methods in practice research, studio practice being the first I would list. Documentation, which is important in practice research, is a method. The plan to experience the work of other artists is a method, I mean, a more formal plan. Action research might be a method. Participant observation might be a method. Book-based research is a method, and there are others. So I do think we can fill in that blank under methodology on an application form. Practice research, I would argue, is the methodology, and then there are various methods that we use in a multi-mode inquiry. And my very first practice research PhD student, now a lecturer at Leeds, Anna Fenimore, has recently talked about her creative process and broken it down into sub-methods, if you like. She talks about anticipation, imagination and projection, playing, pretense and pleasure, direction, repetition and or insistence, and editing, mise-en-scène and composition. So, it's a subdivision, and I'm sure you would have others, but that could also be part of one's method sequence, as you call it. So, for me, to cut to the chase, a practice as research submission is likely to include a product, first of all, the practice, an exhibition, a film, a blog, a score, a performance. But, and this is the first difference for research, it has to have a durable record. Now, performance is ephemeral, as we know, and it's much argued about the nature of its ontology, but that's what's required at the moment. So we tend to record the performance and drop it down onto a DVD and bind it in to the book that we submit for a PhD. We can talk about these things later on, but it needs a durable record at the moment. And there's some caveats to that, because some people have submitted blogs as PhDs, and how durable a record of blog is questionable. But you can see the kinds of debates that go on with university regulators when that kind of thing is proposed. So the second thing you need is documentation of process. The more I've worked with practice research, the more I've come to think that process reveals the insights as much, if not more, than the product itself. And so I strongly advocate documentation of process. And again, that can be in various forms: sketchbooks, photographs, DVDs, many other things it can be. Very often things that practitioners do anyway in their practice, but it just needs a particular inflection for practice research. And then the third dimension is complementary writing, which includes locating practice in a lineage of influences and a conceptual framework for the research. I just want to unpack that a little bit. I've used the term complementary writing for some time, very deliberately, because as I see it, it complements the performance practice, if that's what it is. It doesn't stand in for it, let alone translate it. Now, very often practitioners would say things like, well, if I could put it into words, I wouldn't have to dance it. And I have some sense of that. I mean, that's a meaningful utterance. But it doesn't seem to me these things are mutually exclusive in the context of research. And one of the problems in terms of articulating the research inquiry and evidencing it is the problematic of how you share the research insight. Now, again, I am saying the practice evidences the research inquiry. So the first thing you would do would be to show the practice. But there are other things that you might also do to help people understand what the research inquiry is. So complementing for me writing is about the research inquiry, not about the practice itself. And it's a subtle distinction I'm making there. The idea of locating your practice in a lineage of influences has become increasingly important in the way I work with practitioner researchers. If research is about new knowledge or substantial new insights, and we're claiming that the practitioner research we're engaged in is producing those insights, how do we know if they're new if we don't know what's old? Okay. Now, in a traditional research inquiry for a PhD, people start out with a literature review. And part of the idea of that is to read everything that's written about your subject so that you're on top of it, and that indeed you demonstrate that you're on top of it by writing up your literature review. It seems to me the equivalent we really need in practice research is a practice review, and that's what I advocate for my students. It can also be interwoven with a literature review. Again, they're not mutually exclusive, but a practice review is more important perhaps as a starting point than a literature review. The other important thing about it is that identification. If you can get to a point where you say, well, my work is in this domain, and it's a bit like that person's and that company's, but they're doing these things, what I'm doing is this, you can bring out what is your contribution, your substantial new insight in your research inquiry. So it's really useful in that way. And then the final bit of that last bullet, the conceptual framework, is that I see if the intelligent practice is engaged in an inquiry in the contemporary, and it's very likely to resonate with inquiry in other kinds of domains. So I see the process of reading not being so much in a kind of linear underpinning of your research inquiry, but a kind of opening up to people investigating the same kinds of things in other ways in other disciplines. And what you're looking for is resonances between those two things. And again, I use the word resonance a lot in this context. I'll say a bit more about that when I get to the model, which is coming very soon. So just before the model, these are the adjustments that I think that you need to make to move from a practitioner to become a practitioner-researcher. You need to specify a research inquiry at the outset. Now, again, artists have resisted this, saying, well, we just go in and we start exploring. We don't know what the inquiry is going to be till we get going. That's true of nearly all researchers in all disciplines. It's embarking on a journey. That's the exciting bit about research. And very often the journey goes off in different directions from the one you set out on at the beginning. But I do think it's helpful, and very often the institution requires this by way of the application form or whatever it might be, or the funding form that you might have to fill in. Identifying that inquiry. So you should do that at the outset in the full knowledge that it may well change and go somewhere else. But that's the starting point. So again, a professional practitioner might not do that. They might start engaging in intelligent investigation in their practice, but they wouldn't necessarily identify what the research inquiry was. So that's the first difference I would make. Secondly, you build moments of critical reflection into your timeline. So precisely because practice as research is very absorbing and people get very involved in it, and it needs a lot of skills and it has many dimensions, you can get so absorbed in it that you lose sight of the research inquiry that you identified at the outset. So I do suggest you literally build in times where you put the studio practice on hold for a moment and step back and say, is the inquiry still going on here? Is it still the inquiry that I started out with? And if not, how has it changed so we can redefine it? And then you're asking yourself, am I getting the evidence that I'm going to need when I get to the end of the inquiry to demonstrate it? So you need to step back. Critical reflection is, stepping back is the first thing. And then thirdly, you need to document your process, particularly to try and capture moments of insight. Now, documentation is problematic, and there's a lot to be said about it, which I haven't got time for today, but I do think that it's necessary, and you can't document everything, first of all because it would interfere with the process itself, but secondly because if you did document everything, you'd end up with miles of footage that you wouldn't know what to do with. So it's a kind of developing a sense of when something's happening in the process that's worth capturing. If you look at it in hindsight, people are saying to me, well, if only I'd recorded something about that rehearsal last week, because it was really exciting. It's trying to just be ahead of those moments and see it coming and make sure you've got whatever kind of documentary means that you need to capture that moment. And then ultimately that will appear as evidence of your research inquiry. You need to locate your praxis in a lineage of similar practices. I've talked about that, so I won't gloss that. In a practice review. And then relate your specific inquiry to broader contemporary debate. And I put references in brackets there because ultimately that will appear in the complementary writing, probably in traditional academic written form with traditional academic referencing. You're referencing the conceptual frameworks that your praxis is resonating with. So those are the adjustments that I think you need to make to move from being a practitioner to a practitioner-researcher. Just to gloss that with a few processes, you need to build reading and reflection time into your work schedule. The few practice research projects that I've been involved in examining that have not been very successful, very often the practice has been undertaken and then people decide that they ought to start doing some reading in relation to that practice. And that seems to me not the way to do it. The reading should start from the outset. It should be a parallel process to find those resonances. And at the very worst, people have sought to grasp a major theory to somehow justify what they think is happening in that practice. And that's usually a disaster. So building the reading into the timeline of your work schedule from the outset is important. So although I don't start with a literature review with my PhD students, we start with a reading program. And the other problem about practice research is that the conceptual frameworks could be many and varied. There isn't a single narrow domain that you're researching. It's very often interdisciplinary, and you can't be on top of deep reading in all the areas your process might touch on. So that needs quite a bit of thinking about negotiation in terms of what kind of reading you do. In all instances of PhDs I've supervised, students have found a resonance in the work. It's always happened so far, I'm touching wood. But you start out with a wide frame of reference, and then things begin to emerge as more important. It might be, a space, and you read more about space or whatever it might be. And so it narrows down a bit as you go on, but it can start quite wide. And I think that's a particular it's a difficulty of interdisciplinary research anyway, but much practice research touches on a number of areas. You need to map your conceptual framework, since the field of inquiry may spill across several disciplines. I've just said that. Avoid undertaking several projects or several PhDs. It's very good advice. There have been instances, I think we've put them behind us in history now, where people have been asked to write more than the traditional 80,000 words because they were doing a practice-based PhD. That's a complete nonsense and a misunderstanding, obviously. But at the outset, it's worth marking, and sometimes marking this formally with the university if you're doing a PhD, what the balance is. If you're doing a 50-50 PhD, then you're going to write 30 to 40,000 words, including your documentation in my book, and the other 50% is the practice itself. If you start writing 80,000 words, you're marginalizing the practice. Now, contrary to the resistance to writing at the start of the Practice Research Initiative, I actually find that students do have a lot to say in writing, and quite often want to write a lot more than 40,000 words. And I mean, we have to scope the thing appropriately, and that takes some negotiation. Another dimension where we can get confused here is that a lot of practice research projects talk about the impact of their practice on the experiences of the practice. And I do think we need a methodology to address that. How do we know? But if you ask that question too hard, you can end up doing a sort of social scientific research study, which would be a PhD in its own right. So that's another way you can end up doing more than one PhD. So we need to be aware of keeping this balance and believing that the practice does evidence the research, and then ensuring that the related things that I'm talking about have their appropriate place. And then think in advance about documentation, including experience and response, and build this into your timescale and your budget, because these things can take time and they can cost money, depending on what you're going to do. So that needs to be thought through at the outset. Okay. Ooh, that's good. We now arrive at my model, which you won't be able to read from there because it's too small. But if you just see to your left, there's copies of my model. Would you like to pass them along so you can actually see it in, I hope, a legible form? So what the model does, first of all, is maps different kinds of knowing onto each other. So in the top box we have know how. In the left-hand bottom box we have know what. In the right-hand bottom box we have know that. And I see these as three different modes of knowing. Know that is the most familiar in the academy because it's traditional academic knowledge, what I frame as outsider, distant knowledge. Susan Melrose called this spectatorship studies when she said that most writing about performance is written by people who see it, not people who do it. And that's a very good thing to say. And one of the things the Practice Research Initiative is doing is bringing both those things into a play. So I'm not against spectatorship studies, but outsider knowledge can be mapped onto insider knowledge, which is in the top box there. So in that box, you would have the conceptual frameworks that I've talked about, and you would have cognitive propositional knowledge, traditional academic knowledge. So I'm not abandoning that. That's also available to us. But at the top, is know-how, insider close-up knowing, experiential haptic knowing, performative knowing, tacit knowledge, embodied knowledge. These are the things that arts practitioners know about through their doing, and that they've been much overlooked in research terms. They've been overlooked in terms of helping us understand how performance works, how it's made, how it functions, all those things. But they're also been overlooked as a contribution to knowledge, as a mode of knowing, which, as I've hinted before in my brief reflection on the development of epistemology, that's very important. One of the problems with know-how, however, is it is close up and not necessarily very evident. It can be tacit, it can be silent. So the arrow going from the know-how box to the know-what box is really a matter of trying to make know-how into know-what by making the tacit more explicit. So we know what works as practitioners. We know what methods we use if we think about it and reflect on it. We know what our principles of composition are. We know what impacts, or we have some idea what impacts, and we know what's distinctive about our work. But all those things come out of critical reflection, which some artists do and some artists don't. But if you're going to engage in practice research, it seems to me that that's what you need to do, to step back, as I say, out of the timeline, reflect on what you're doing, and try to make the tacit explicit. If you do that, then you also have a variety of means to disseminate that knowing and to share it in the way that the Academy demands. So at the centre of the model is the arts praxis, a word that you'll have gathered I use a lot. And what I mean by that, as defined in the box, is theory imbricated within practice. Because I challenge the historical binary separation of theory and practice in the Western intellectual tradition. And there's intelligent doing thinking as there's intelligent analytic thinking. And the two work together. So I use the word praxis to avoid using theory and practice. They're imbricated within each other as I see it. So importantly, the arrows on this diagram go both ways. You can understand something that you read in abstract, a piece of philosophy, if you like, you can come at it through knowing. And that's why I find the term resonance so useful. What I've seen happen on numerous occasions is people exploring something practically in the studio and then doing some reading over there, which at first sight might not seem to relate to it. And then resonances emerge. And the practice can be better understood by the crystallizing of the verbal discourse. Conversely, the verbal discourse can be better understood and enhanced by practical insights. So those arrows going both ways are very deliberate. In terms of articulating and evidencing the research inquiry then, it's a matter in my model of mapping different modes of knowing onto each other. So in the multi-mode inquiry, different kinds of evidence are produced. And they have strength through convergence, which is a recognized research method of convergence of knowledge. I mean, in the social sciences, there would be different data sets that will be mapped onto each other in this kind of way. But that's rather too positivist a model for what I'm talking about. But it's a similar kind of principle. I'm suggesting that these different explorations of knowing produce different kinds of findings, and those findings can then map onto each other, and that mapping consolidates the findings and strengthens them in terms of a research outcome. Okay, so I'm just coming to a conclusion now. That an art or media work or other practice may exceptionally stand on its own as a research outcome judged by peer review. It seems to me that if we want to say the practice can stand alone, the only way it can be adjudged to be research is by peers. And peer review is a very important aspect of research review in all domains. It's very interesting that when the government in the forthcoming National Research Audit wanted to turn it into bibliometrics, some of you will know about this, just the number of citations of your work. It proved problematic not only to practitioner researchers in the arts, where it's obviously problematic, but it proved problematic to scientists, mathematicians, everybody resisted it. So they said research findings cannot be reduced to that kind of numerical strategy. But if we want to say the practice is going to stand alone, peer review is the only way I think we can judge it. But it's also arts and media practices and processes may demonstrate critical rigour and even make arguments. I haven't had much time to talk about rigour today because one of the questions that are constantly asked about practice research is where is its rigour? And we do have some answers to that. I haven't talked about this today, but I can do in discussion if you wish. But I think through developing the methodology, we have developed rigour in the different ways in which we work. There's a rigour in process. I mean, going back to Anna Fenimore's model, for example, when you get to the compositional editing stage, her fourth stage, there's a rigorous process at work. And we all know work that is rigorous and work which isn't. I mean, if you see Goat Island's work, you know it's rigorous, for example. Yeah? And you conversely, and I won't name names, but you've seen other work which isn't rigorous. We understand that rigour. It's a different kind of rigour from a scientific data set rigour, but nevertheless it has rigour. But we need as a community, I think, to develop that and make the case for it. And also that substantial insights may emerge through play between aspects of process. So the sense that one of our methods may be play doesn't mean it can't be involved in research. Finally, I'll come back to the question I posed earlier, whether you can just present your practice alone. And the answer depends, I think, on your understanding of knowledge and its dissemination. The approach I take goes with a more traditional research orientation, which demonstrates process and method. And if you go with that requirement, it seems to be unlikely that the findings can be evident in the product alone because it may not be able to articulate its own context. But I'm open to discussion about that. But certainly the way my mother advocates doing other things which assist in articulating, evidencing and disseminating the practice research findings. And I think that's all I have to say. I've just got the references here, things I've used that you can get from me afterwards if you wish. Anna Fenimore's book on the rehearsal and accompanied pigeon theatre, Susan Melrose's stuff, which Susan generally publishes online. My new book, which is published in March, Practice Research in the Arts, and we'll come, I think, to Alva Noé's Action in Perception, and Vygotsky in that translation I use. Okay, so I will wind up there. I haven't talked for too long. And Johannes, I think, still are going to join us. Okay. Yeah.
So I'm going to ask Stellak to join Robin on the left.
Do you want me to move in?
And
in the frame?
this was just an idea, and perhaps not even the best idea, because it would be equally interesting perhaps to ask one of our PhD students to join us. Which, if someone would like to step forward, I would be happy to have you here. And I just want to say one thing about my current role in regards to colleagues, and more importantly to the PhD students. I am charged with helping the REF exercise that you mentioned. So my beloved friend and colleague Stella is one of my members who has to produce a portfolio dealing exactly with these questions that you outlined, and that's why I thought it would be interesting to hear from an artist and perhaps the struggle or the discomfort that you might have experienced. Certainly I must also admit that I feel discomforted by the whole scenario, and I don't want to go into it, but I always saw myself as a choreographer, studying dance theater and wanting to do that. And of course I ended up in universities, and so I enjoy my performance work and I enjoy writing. But I never wanted to deal with that level of self-meditation on what is my knowledge, what is Stellak's knowledge that he produces, or you proposed a slightly different phrase today, substantial new insights. What is the reflective methodology that I apply to my making a dance? Or have I done enough documentation in the crucial rehearsal where it worked, where it didn't work? Perhaps each of them are interesting. But no, I mean, the discomfort is now replaced by, I think, my honest, I feel I owe my students that I advise them well in how they approach this process. Some of them are also considering themselves artists, and in their own ways express sometimes discomfort with the rigor of conceptualizing, contextualizing, locating their work. But then I have other PhD students, and Jessica is a good example, who are actually very, very, very excited about, I think, this hybrid development of a artistic, you call it practice, an artistic craft and the theoretical dimension. So in a way, maybe I just want to pose the question to Stellak. Stellak, this discussion on knowledge and rigor and insight, how has it affected you here in the university?
This afternoon, more substantially than at other times. I guess, though, because we've got such limited time, I'd like to ask Robin a question and tease out a few more opinions from him. Can you make a distinction, or do you want to make a distinction, or do you want to say one way of phrasing it is better than the other, or is it a very different approach? Rather than practice-based, rather than practice-led research, project-based research. Do you think we can have project-based research? It seems to me one is more about a process and one is more about a particular outcome that generates new insights. Practice-led seems to me more about a process of constant inquiry.
Yes, I would agree with that. And when I said that for me, the process and the reflection document process has become as important, if not more important, than the product. That's very much along that idea. And in PhD terms, a student might produce several projects over 3 years, or however long the span is, which is a project, and the whole thing is a project. So it has iterations, but the research is the project. So I'm very happy with that sense of it. I think it also leads us away from the idea of someone misunderstanding that their professional practice might not quite be research or be presented as research, even though it might be intelligent practice. So the notion of a project is very much really what I'm talking about, yeah.
And the other sort of dilemma that I see, especially with some of my other colleagues, if we're doing, for example, performances involving interactive media, sensor technologies, computer, software programming, it's a little bit simpler to substantiate a kind of a research process than, for example, a practitioner who's more a director of a more traditional theatrical production. And I see this as a real dilemma for that kind of practitioner, where, you know, what is knowledge, what is new insight, becomes, you know, very ambiguous and not as clearly stated as if you're doing work with, you know, new media, for example.
Yes. No, I think that's absolutely right. Devised work, although I've put in the caveat that an original iteration might not mean it's original research, devised work is much easier to construct as research because it involves some kind of investigative process almost always. If you're a director and you're directing a mainstream play in a mainstream theatre, that can be research, but that's where my whole paraphernalia comes into play. You really need to say what it is. I mean, if you're rereading the play in some kind of way, or if you're putting it in a different historical context for good reasons and so on, which are genuinely insightful about the play, that might be one way of doing it. It might be a process of directing. You might be working with the actors in a particular way, which might not necessarily be manifest in the performance. Then you would need to document the process to show that's what you're doing. And that's why I feel you have to identify a research inquiry and articulate and evidence it. Because if you're doing that, you'll bring out what the research is, whatever the dimension is. Because I know there are some directors who feel that their process is investigative, as it may well be with the actors, just working through the process of putting on the play is an investigative, inquiring process. But the question for academic research is, does it produce new knowledge? It might produce a good production of the play, which people like, and it might work very well with audiences, but does it produce new knowledge? And that seems to be the question we have to ask in an academic context, for good or ill.
And before we open, I think it would be just as well to open it to all of you. This notion of knowledge and review, you mentioned the perhaps crucial function of a peer review. I'm just thinking of the examiners, because let's say if one of our PhD students is doing an experimental project, hybrid, and is reflecting on this process of insight generation, can she expect her examiners to know what they're examining in terms of these different possible processes that a young person might come up with experimentally? How do we know that the examiners can actually be good peers in the review?
Well, the choice of examiners is quite important. It's important to avoid people who are hostile to practice research as a methodology, and there are some. And by saying that, I'm not suggesting that we should choose examiners who give you an easy time, but yes, it is right to try and find examiners who have experience in that domain. Now, that's not always an easy business, but there's more and more people who are coming through practice research routes themselves, working in the academy. People like my colleague Anna Pennywell, for example. She's now a lecturer at Leeds and has examined PhDs. So there are more and more people, I think, available. So you're looking for someone who has some knowledge of that kind of work. But my point would be, in articulating the process of practice research, is it ought to be evident to more or less anybody who examined it, because you would have articulated an evidence to the research inquiry. Where the peer review comes in is in understanding or having a kind of feel for the nature of the process in a way that somebody from outside wouldn't. But curiously, I've talked to groups of scientists about practice research, and they don't have such a problem with it as you might expect. I mean, after all, scientists work in laboratories, they undertake experiments, and they write them up afterwards. It's not so different from what we're doing. It's just that they work with data in a way that we don't typically work with data. So it's not so problematic. I guess it's a question of knowing the field. I mean, when we talk about I talk about location in a lineage. If the question is about a new insight, you need someone who knows the field to be able to assess that, and that's where it becomes most important. But if the candidate, as it were, has researched the field and presented their knowledge of the field and shown, that should be part of the evidencing of the inquiry. So that should be helpful to the examiner in any case.
Sue-Waters had her hand up.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much, Robin, for your talk. I found it very, very stimulating and interesting. I was just wondering, I mean, you know, here we have had practices research PhDs since about 2001.
Yep.
Now, we didn't have really the rules and regulations, you know, which you very, you know, and we're very grateful for, have you know, devised. And I think maybe we just did it without, I guess, just intuiting it rather than actually, you know, coming up with rules and regulations. And one thing that we did do, we had, instead of having this 50-50, where you have 40,000 words and practice of research, we have this continuum where you could actually do more practice and less written work, or less, or the other way around, more written work and less practice. What do you think about that? Do you think that?
I'm fine with that, and I think it's important to try and decide that in advance, so that in the application, as it were, for PhD, that should be stated, and some quantification of what the practice output would be. You know, whether it's a 20-minute choreography or whatever it might be, as a guideline. Now, that can then be adjusted and should be formally adjusted if it changes substantially in that process. There's a couple of things just to say about it, however. The AHRC, having set up PARIP, the Practice Research and Performance Inquiry, halfway through that inquiry, the AHRC announced that 50-50 was the model.
Right.
Now, that doesn't control universities who have their own regulations, but it was just quite interesting that that's what they came up with.
Well, we have changed our regulations since. We have made it more that you a minimum of 40,000 words.
Yeah.
But we didn't put it in terms of 50-50, but we did
Yeah.
make a minimum of 40,000 words. I'm not quite sure I completely agree with that because, but anyway, I mean, I guess that, you know, that is part of the model.
Yeah, I mean, I'd see that more as a maximum than a minimum.
Yeah.
But moving to the University
And
of
so would
London, their minimum was 60,000 words,
Yeah.
which we're having to, because the University of London rules. So quite often it's a matter of finding, and that's why I mentioned the regulators early on. You need negotiations with them. There was one university, which I won't name, that had the scientific method as the criterion for all research degrees. So if you weren't working with whatever you understand the scientific method to be, you could, and they had to change their rules to allow that. And there's another university in the spirit of trying to advocate practice, put a maximum of 15,000 words on the complementary writing.
Right.
And I examined the PhD there, and it was quite clear that the student had been inhibited by that restriction. So I'd like to keep things a little bit fluid.
It's been quite interesting because we have quite a few practices as research PhDs. Sorry, I won't take up too much time.
Yeah.
But because I found this really very interesting, and it's been quite interesting with the examiners. I mean, we've had examiners, you know, that really are very good with practice-based research, and we've also had examiners who actually insist and say, well, how much has been written? Surely this isn't a PhD.
Yeah. Yeah.
And, you know, and it's been quite clear that it's been a practice as research PhD, but, you know, they're a practice-led PhD, but they don't seem to be able to to understand that, which is a bit of a problem because they don't say that to begin with.
Yes, I mean, old habits die hard, and it really surprises me more and more. And some people say, I mean, a colleague who's read my book says I sound defensive at times, but time and time again you come up against it. I mean, I've examined PhDs with another external examiner who've said in the middle of it, well, does the praxis count here?
Yeah, exactly.
Yes, it's a
and I've had that a couple of times, but this notion about, oh, well, isn't this word count a little bit, minimal?
But that's, again, it's the old habit of privileging the logos, isn't it? So if it's not 80,000 words, then it's not a substantial piece of work. So what we've having to argue is that's the substance of the practice. And practices, PR PhDs are hard. They involve so many dimensions, more than writing 80,000 words, that they're not an easy touch at all, in my experience of them. They're quite difficult to do. So we have to keep making that case.
Yeah, I think we're going to have to pass over to Johannes. But I do like your point about not writing not doing two PhDs.
Yes.
No, I totally value your commentary, and you have been involved in this field for so long. I'd like maybe to hear from one of our research guests. Anyone would like to comment? Yes, please. Maybe say your name for the camera.
My name is Nick Wakefield. I'm a practice as research PhD from Royal Holloway.
Yeah.
I'd like to ask about the model and how you would see it figuring in an actual PhD. How much talking about the approach of how practice is working should there be in a PhD? Which the sort of bigger question is that who's your audience with your book and with your talk? Because I felt really affirmed by what you were saying. And yet I felt like the choir, because is it the ref and is it the University of London guidelines and these things that are the people who should be in the seats?
Yes, in part. I mean, the book is partly aimed at regulators, and it says that, as well as practitioner-researchers, and so it deals with institutional matters as well. So all the people who are involved in shifting a culture, which is what we're trying to do, all those people are involved. So it would be nice to think that people beyond the arts disciplines would read it as well, particularly in cognitive disciplines, but also the sciences. It would be interesting to see. So yes, I mean, it's changing a culture on a number of fronts. In terms of the way the model might figure in a PhD, I often start out by thinking in terms of chapters. So there will be a chapter on process, a reflection of process. there might be a chapter on conceptual framework. There might be a chapter on the kind of practice review. So separating out those bits as separate chapters, and I have a kind of model of 4 chapters that might do that. However, the very best writing isn't segmented in quite that way. And the very best writing weaves things in together. So I've just had a student do an upgrade, and she's written a practice review, but it just interweaves all kinds of conceptual frameworks. Now, they probably then need to be teased out more fully later on, but it's really good to see it working intertwined with the practice. So although I have used that model of separate chapters, I actually like them breaking down. So I tend to start out with that, but say to people, well, look, write as you want to write and pull things in, and then you find your own way. So again, I think, I didn't talk about different kinds of writing today, but I think different kind of registers are often needed. But writing the process chapter in the first person, I tend to advocate people writing the conceptual framework chapter, if it's separate, in a traditional academic mode, partly to show that they've mastered, if that's not too gender-loaded a phrase, that way of writing. But really there are different discourses, and I'm really advocating that we draw upon a range of things, because the challenge for everybody is to articulate their findings, for scientists, artists, whoever, and it's finding the best means of doing that. And I'm sure for scientists sometimes it is in numbers and equations. That's their way. So it's being aware of the range of things and using them strategically, if you like. So a mix of writings. I mean, Anna Fenimore's PhD ends with a poem, because there was an aspect of what she'd done. A lot of it is very traditionally philosophical, but it ends with a poem because there was something she felt that she wasn't articulating, that she wanted to try and articulate in words at the end. Fine, On the other hand, I had a student who tried to write the whole of a PhD as a poem, and that didn't work at all.
Could I just add, actually, that I found it really useful. A lot of the great feedback that I've received from faculty at the university about structuring had to do with structuring along the lines of the practice chapters devoted to projects of practice itself. Within that, having themes which are about the findings of the inquiry, driven by the inquiry, and within each of those includes these process conceptual framework, and really useful. Thanks.
Good.
Thanks a lot.
Jessica and Stella had also
Oh.
Jessica,
No,
Okay. My name is Jessica Warden. I'm a PhD student at Brunel. And to give a bit of context, my artistic practice comprises of mainly performance writing. And one of the things I found I just wanted to comment on was this idea of responsibility as a practitioner to present a mode of communicating that educates your audience as well. Or at least that was, for me, one of the goals of taking up a PhD, was not just to see if I could communicate on an academic level, but also to create a mode of writing that simultaneously educates my audience, rather than trying to adhere to a pre-established kind of value.
And is that sharing understandings of a process or a product, as it were?
Well, both.
Yeah.
Since what I proposed is kind of both at the same time. So it kind of a practice and kind of an academic product that are intertwined. But I really hate public speaking. So.
And have you found a mode of writing that does that? Have you?
Well, that's what I'm currently working on.
Yeah.
So I've produced academic texts and writerly texts, and I'm trying to find a symbiosis.
Well, I think that's good.
Yeah. But I mean, I think that's an extension. It's a responsibility that we should all that we all share, and ideally we should all aim towards that, because I mean, you see the same thing in performance spaces. They have a certain goal of how they want to communicate to an audience and the type of work they would like to present. And it seems really odd that practitioners enter into academia and then completely shift the ways in which they're trying to communicate with their audience, and that they no longer regard kind of their peers or academia as audience, but rather some sort of I've completely forgotten the word, but something that they have to answer to.
Mm-hmm.
Well, in a way, you are in the discussion last month. Several recently completed PhDs mentioned that they have to do defenses. In Germany, we call it defense.
Yes.
In Sweden too.
Yeah.
At the final moment, you have to defend what it is you just done. And that's sort of an interesting notion that you are sort of attacked.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. Yes.
It's not any PhD that you do that in private, don't you?
Yeah.
So, I mean...
But it presupposes...
Well, in Britain, you call it Vira, which is more civilized than...
Yeah. And it presupposes a kind of propositional discourse, and that you've made an argument, and you have to defend that argument. And practice research is not that kind of thing. Although I believe practice can make arguments if you want it to, contra to Derrida, who says it can't. But it's about as Susan Merrill's reminded us, writing is a practice. And what you're talking about is developing the practice of writing. That's also important in this work. But in that sense, the traditional academy has a very narrow range of discourses, or just one discourse, and that's the discourse of analytic propositions, which can be defended in that way. And yet, the model of knowledge and knowing has shifted from that. I mean, even if there were objective knowledge, I mean, that's been critiqued from a feminist position as a male discourse, pretense at objectivity and masculine superiority. You can come at it in different ways, but it's been challenged in all kinds of ways. So then it opens up, it seems to me, a range of different discursive positions. And that's why my mantra is articulating and evidencing the research inquiry, and you have to find the way best to do it for your particular inquiry. So, it's the practice, the documentation of practice, the writing about this practice, all those things are in the frame. And I guess for me, to come back to what you're sort of hinting about artists going elsewhere, historically, before practice research, as it were, any artist coming into the academy to do a PhD didn't have the choice but to write a traditional thesis. It is still the case in Germany quite substantially, and in many other countries. So that's become part of a habit as well. What I think the Practice Research Initiative has established is that we can research, inquire, and get findings through practice. And that's a big shift. And why I was involved in this, because my own publications are traditional writing and articles and books and so on. But I was head of a department which was entirely practice-based, dance, theatre, music, visual arts, writing, with some very intelligent practitioners. In the research frame, their work wouldn't have counted at all unless they'd all stopped doing what they were doing and become writers in the traditional academy, which was not their strength. It seemed to me daft. So why I got initially involved in this initiative was to make the case. And the more I got involved in it, the more I've become interested in it philosophically in terms of modes of knowing and knowledge and so on, and in making that case. And at worst, arts would be excluded from research in traditional terms, which seems to me to be nonsensical. And it has come about by institutions merging. I mean, in this country and elsewhere, formerly freestanding art schools, theatre conservatoire and so on, had their own means of, not so much research, but their own peer review of standards and so on within a narrow community. When that comes into, those set of practices get drawn into a university, they then come up against all the university protocols of what research is. And that's what I've been addressing. I feel what I've tried to do is find an accommodation between those protocols. Now, it's not to say we have to accept everything the university sector does. I think we've made significant changes, but we can't simply expect it to abandon everything that it's held dear for a long time and just to accommodate us. So some artists don't like my approach because they feel it leans too far towards the institution, and I fully acknowledge it's tried to find that sort of middle way. But I think it's given a lot of scope for practices that wouldn't otherwise be admitted.
Thank you, Robin. A brief interjection, and then we come back.
Oh, yeah.
Yes. No, I guess the concern is because now we're educating our young artists essentially in the university environment, which uses the paradigm of research to authenticate their practice. Do you see this practitioner-theoretician as a kind of a third way or a mushing together of two rather different approaches? And also, of course, a university institutional setting for the arts with so many constraints. I mean, often we know that art needs to be messy, sometimes pornographic, even dangerous at times. How do you kind of incorporate those more extreme positions that artists might take with an institutional setting that has this research paradigm as a means of authenticating? I mean, even trying to get a biopsy done for a bioart project required responding to 51 questions from health and safety and from the ethics department. I mean, this would essentially stifle any sort of impulsive, intuitive, obsessive, and other kind of messy artistic practices to ever occurring.
Well, it might do. Let's start with the last bit. Yes, of course. I mean, institutionalized academic research involves institutionalized ethics procedures. So if you're engaged with quasi-medical research, if it involves a biopsy of what you want to do, if you're Orlan or whatever, yes, that's going to come under those regulations, and it could be inhibitive. You just might not want to go through the process. I'd like to think that you could take it through the process and risk is acceptable. I mean, as in risk assessment, it's not that you shouldn't ever take any risks, that you should have foreseen those risks and been aware of them, and I think that's possible. So I don't think it absolutely stifles. I take your point, it might militate against. So that's that point. Also, there may well be artists for whom the academy is not the right place to operate. I mean, it's not the case that all artists are obliged to do PhDs, is it? You know, that seems to me, again, a misunderstanding. It's not that it's a requirement to be an artist. And there are many people, I think, who are better off operating outside the academy, whether it's risk-taking or otherwise, because they don't really want to engage in research. All I would say is that when artists moved into the academy, or their institution got brought into the academy, then we've had to engage. That, it's an historical thing. That's why it's an institutionalized thing. And my own view is, however, that arts practices have been very much enhanced by the research environment, because I do believe that the processes I'm talking about in the end make for better art. Now, not everybody would agree with that, I know, and one of my colleagues from Manchester was engaged in research into whether in the visual arts artistic practices have become less innovative and risk-taking, if you like, because of the influence of the academy. I'm not sure there's any evidence for that. And I do believe that by engaging with ideas in a kind of open way, which is broadly what I understand research to be, I think that feeds back into good arts practice. That's my own view of it. And that comes out having taught in universities for a lifetime.
Jessica.
Another word.
That you use the term good arts practice, especially since there are really amazing practices that could never be discussed in academic circles for various reasons, either due to the inability of the practitioner to use academic language or their refusal to do so. I mean, Ron Athey is a very good example of someone who's doing incredible work, very challenging work, and he basically refuses to work within academia. He works with academics, alongside academics, but doesn't engage in academic research, not because he's, mentally deficit in any way, but because he chooses not to personally engage with that type of communicating. And I mean, his process is still good, his work is still good.
Yeah.
He has a good artistic practice, so.
No, I certainly didn't mean to imply that artists who chose not to be involved in the academy weren't good artists.
No, I know.
I mean, I'm just saying that there doesn't seem to be any evidence that those artists who have got involved in the academy are producing less good work because of that, of all this parallel research process. That's what I mean. So, yes, clearly there's good work by people who are outside the academy and those who refuse to be part of it, and I absolutely respect that. And it's very interesting that, I mean, why I moved to Central School is because I'm very interested in working in a conservatoire whose values are about professional training and professional values, but has moved to become a research institution. It's a very interesting hybrid. And we are negotiating a range of very different values in that context.
It may very well be generating a kind of an alternate genre of, of artistic outcomes.
Yes.
So
Yes.
it's not a matter of trying to incorporate previous artistic strategies with academia.
Yeah.
Rather, this is generating some kind of like a kind of a third approach, which is neither necessarily the messy artistic approach in the past, nor the purely academic research-based work that we sort of associate with theory, but it's a kind of third way.
Yes. That's probably the way of describing it.
I thought for a moment, sorry, the artist you mentioned was Ron Athey?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I thought for a moment you were questioning our guest in terms of his comment on the artistic or the practice production within a research context has perhaps increased and gotten better. And here, I know we're coming to the end of our time. I was wondering actually, since you mentioned substantial durable records that perhaps need to be accumulated. And I know that in the Empire debate, Simon Biggs mentioned that probably over the last 10 years, how many PhDs would you think? 100, 500, 800? So imagine there is now an increasing number of research outputs. And I have, of course, not seen most of these in terms of the practice. So I don't know how good practice in research context is. It may actually be very bad. And so I'm not sure whether now your lineage and your knowledge of the practice field includes knowing all these various research productions that have been entered into the knowledge field as PhDs. Do we know how interesting, how provocative, how good they are? Are you confident in really saying the practice is very interesting within academia? Because I don't think so.
Yeah, I suppose, I mean, my remark was in a more general sense rather than specific sense, that I think the artistic practice is enhanced by critical reflection, to put it in a simple phrase.
Is that really something you
Yes,
believe?
I do believe that, and I believe that it's enhanced by engagement, open engagement with a range of ideas, what I call in my model conceptual frameworks. So that feeds into the process of
inquiry. When I studied theatre at a non-art school, however, my German university had the nerve to bring in people like Grotowski or Peter Brook or Robert Wilson, and we were actually observing them, let's say, working on a scene. And these people, of course, would have no need to do a PhD, right? But if you're looking at the increasing number of PhD practitioners, whether they are directing theatre or perhaps writing plays or doing new intermediate practice, where do I find out as a peer reviewer to see, first of all, a lot of examiners don't even see the live work but see the DVD, yeah? Which is another problem, yeah? If you only see the DVD. At least I have experienced vivas where the examiners had not seen the actual artwork, only the DVD or the slides. So in terms of knowing the quality of the work, I am very hesitant to really have an opinion yet.
Right, okay. Well, the British tradition is that the examiners do see the live practice if it is a live practice. So in my experience, that's always been the case. There is then also a DVD version for the durable record, which is clearly not the same thing. And we all understand that. I mean, there's a whole problematics about documentation, which I haven't got time to go into, but we know it's not the same thing. But that's the durable record such as it stands. if you want to access it, then part of the point of the durable record, the positive part of that, is that these things are available. So you can call up these PhDs if you wanted to say, well, let's examine, let's take a piece of research, let's examine whether these practices are interesting or not. We could call them up and see that, at least in DVD form, which is not, of course, the same thing, but I've not actually done that. So it's a more general sense that I just feel that the kind of framework of research inquiry that I've talked about has produced some very good work. I mean, but it's not the only way, you know. I mean, it's there's plenty of good practitioners. I absolutely agree with you, whose methods are very interesting and very rigorous very often, that are not within the academy. I certainly wouldn't want to suggest that they can only come from the academy, but they do come from the academy.
And I think, obviously, I think this is provocative territory, and we could go on for a long time. I really liked your comment about such discussion needing to address regulators and perhaps examiner bodies and, you know, those who write the outlines for application even, because I think we're also meeting regulation at the level of entrance, you know, and how you set out advising a PhD candidate to structure their career. And this need for documentation, we tend to forget how complicated that actually is to enact in practice. I don't always have the time to run the camera myself.
Well, I think the other problematic about that too, and you'd probably agree, Robin, is that you know, even if you're quite astute and the camera is somewhat invisible, it's probably going to affect the moment that it's documenting. So there is that dilemma, and I know you realise that because you tried to say that you don't want to document everything, you want to try to capture those moments of insight.
My horribly self-conscious rehearsals with the camera.
But it is a dilemma because I think it's just an inherently difficult thing to document, to document a process that includes those significant moments of perception and insight.
I absolutely accept that, but we're more and more used to cameras in all kinds of ways in everyday life. So it's not such a problem. But if it's built into the process generally, so that you don't suddenly bring a camera in and get that moment, so it is very embarrassing and obvious. If it's there occasionally in rehearsals, and sometimes it's used and sometimes it's not, it becomes possible. But yes, of course I accept that, just as I accept that, you know, it's been well argued that documentation can never stand for the thing itself. And yes, I accept that argument. On the other hand, that if you can't see the thing itself, the record is useful. It gives you some insight as to what went on. You know, I think it's useful in this context.
We are running out of time. I'm so thankful, Robin, that you came here today, and hopefully it was of some interest to you. Thank you for the audience. Thank you for the audience, and thank you, Robin Nelson.
Thank you for the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. It's been nice to have had this presentation a few months ago. Our riff out comes a juice.
Well, one of the points I've been trying to get this book out quickly is to you know, give people a frame for submission to ref, because what I want is for this to be better accepted in the academic community. So the better we do